Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. Got something for you today, a little bit different from the usual Max Mora or Robert Whiting article. This one is titled Yasuke and the African Presence in Japan. So, today we're going to dive into this kind of fascinating but often misunderstood part of history, which is the presence of Africans in Japan during the Sengoku and Edo periods. We're going to be focusing on the story of Yasuke, the African samurai, and addressing some of the passionate beliefs about African influence in Japanese history. So now, just starting off, I understand and respect the passion some or many feel about African heritage and its global influence. Okay, I get it, representation matters, and it's important to acknowledge and celebrate African contributions worldwide. However, I think it's also important to ground our understanding in historical evidence. So let me present some of the evidence to you today. And before I start, I'll just highlight some of the points, like things like historical context. So during the Sengoku, or the warring states, and the Edo periods in Japan, the societal structure was highly organized and distinct. They had a samurai class, the daimyo, which is the feudal lords, and intricate social hierarchies defining these eras. So we also get the historical records. You know what? Yasuke is one of the most well-documented Africans in Japan during this time. His story is recorded in sources like the Koki and Jesuit letters. Yasuke arrived in Japan as a servant of a Jesuit missionary, Alessandro Valignano, in 1581, and his presence caused quite a stir, and he eventually came into the service of the powerful daimyo Oda Nobunaga. However, beyond Yasuke, there's very little substantial evidence of a broader African influence in Japanese society during this period. We also have to look at the Portuguese and Jesuit influence. Most Africans who came to Japan, they did through the Portuguese traders and Jesuit missionaries, usually as servants or slaves. You might not like to hear that, but it's kind of a fact. And while their presence was notable, it was not widespread enough to significantly impact the larger societal structure of Japan. And look, genetic evidence. Just want to say, genetic studies, they reveal little evidence of African ancestry in Japanese populations. What do we look at? We look at haplogroups that are common in East Asian populations. Those would be D, O, and C. And they're distinct from those prevalent in African populations, just like E, A, and B. So these studies show that genetic markers typical of East Asians and Japanese do not align with those of African descent. So it kind of highlights the minimal impact of African genes in Japan's historical population. And on addressing misconceptions, which I'll do, you need to clarify what it means to have samurai heritage. The samurai class, it's evolved from local family clan-based structures unique to Japan. It was kind of rooted in Japanese history, traditions, and the feudal system. So it really makes the idea of significant African influence highly unlikely. The typical samurai definition is they're warriors bound by a strict code of honor and loyalty, and their lineage was primarily Japanese. So, as far as historical interpretation, again, while these contemporary desires for representation are there, if you're going to do a historical interpretation, it should be evidence-based. Now, it's important to distinguish between historical fiction and documented history. So, for example, a lot of people cite this. They go, Yasuke was given a sword. Well, what kind of sword was it? I think it was a ceremonial scabbard. There's one piece where they called it sayamaki. So that made it, if you're thinking of the Sengoku time, kind of a wooden lacquer scabbard. And inside would have a symbolic wooden sword. So this says more about Nobunaga's fascination and appreciation of Yasuke rather than indicating like, oh, widespread African influence or something. So, yeah, I mean, if we look at the cultural exchange between Japan and other regions, you didn't see significant African influence within Japanese society. The presence of Africans in Japan during the period was primarily through their roles as servants or slaves to Europeans. Now, if you want, you're definitely able to go there and look for reasonably credible historical sources and primary documents and books. There's one in English. It's called African Samurai, and it's written by Thomas Lockley and Geoffrey Gerard, and they try to provide detailed accounts of Yasuke's life. So I think doing that, you can get more of a constructive dialogue about this issue. Anyways, let's move forward and just get started on Yasuke, the African samurai in Japan. We start with his early life and arrival in Japan. So his early life remains actually still largely shrouded in mystery, but we know he was originally from Portuguese East Africa, which is modern-day Mozambique. Why? Because it was stated in the first volume of History of the Japanese Church, which was written by François Solier in 1627. It indicates that Yasuke arrived in Japan around 1579 as a servant, or possibly a bodyguard, to an Italian Jesuit missionary. His name, Alessandro Valignano. So Valignano had stopped in Mozambique, and he spent a long time in India before he brought Yasuke to Japan. So some say it's unclear whether Yasuke was brought directly from Mozambique or had traveled to India earlier. Well, I think probably that Valignano had picked Yasuke up in Mozambique. Anyways, what about this encounter with Oda Nobunaga? So when he arrived in Japan, it was during the Sengoku period. So there was a lot of the time social upheaval and political conflict. So he was brought to meet Oda Nobunaga because, well, Nobunaga, keep in mind, was one of Japan's most powerful warlords. And the date was February 23rd, 1581. Why? Nobunaga was fascinated by Yasuke's appearance and he initially thought his dark skin was ink, like a tattoo. And so they made him strip and wash to confirm its authenticity, like it didn't wash off. So once he was convinced, then Nobunaga showed great interest in Yasuke and he took him into his service. So his mere presence caused quite a stir in Kyoto. Think of paparazzi or something. There were fights and stone throwing amongst curious onlookers. And he was described, again, in a historical text called the Shincho Koki, as being about 26 to 27 years old. And they described him as having the strength of 10 men and a body as black as a cow, or maybe they meant an ox. Okay. Anyways, the role and status in Nobunaga's service. So Yasuke did serve Nobunaga for approximately 15 months because he served for 15 months until Nobunaga's death. So this is where his exact status under Nobunaga is the subject of considerable debate. So some sources refer to him as a, quote, samurai, implying a certain status and a set of responsibilities. Now, here, probably need to clarify, the term samurai during the Sengoku period was somewhat flexible. And so, more than likely, Yasuke was a retainer with duties akin to maybe a bodyguard, junior officer, or servant. He was given a residence and, as I indicated before, a ceremonial sword, signifying his status. And although some said there were rumors that Nobunaga intended to make him his lord in the future, this is probably an exaggeration. Now, there's another book in Japanese, I don't know why. In English, I think it's translated to The History of Oda Nobunaga, Beyond the Nobunaga Chronicle, by Bensei Publishing in 2009 on pages 311 to 312. And they specifically say Yasuke was given what was described as a sayamaki. And if that's correct, during the Sengoku period is, as I indicated, just probably a wooden lacquered scabbard. The thing that goes outside the sword. So instead of the inside containing a fine steel sword, it probably just held a symbolic wooden one. Yes. Okay. Don't call it a dildo. Okay, so military involvement. There was another thing. Yasuke was present during several critical events in Nobunaga's later life in those long 15 months, including the Honnoji incident, which was on June 2nd, 1582. So, when Akechi Mitsuhide betrayed Nobunaga, Yasuke happened to be at Nobunaga's side. But after Nobunaga was forced to commit seppuku, or some of you call it harakiri, or ritual suicide, Yasuke fled to Nijo Castle to inform Nobunaga's son, very similar name, Oda Nobunaga. So Yasuke then fought along Nobutada's forces, but he was eventually captured by Akechi's troops. So now here, this is where probably his gaijin status or African status saved him, because unlike the Japanese captives, Yasuke was spared execution. Kind of for a racist reason, because instead Mitsuhide considered Yasuke an animal and not Japanese. You have Japanese humans. Anyways. And what did he do? He handed him over to the Jesuits at Nambanji Temple. Gosh, he thought he was an animal. I'm really glad he didn't choose to eat him or something. Anyways, according to the Annals of the Society of Jesus in Japan, this Akechi Mitsuhide decided not to kill Yasuke because he believed Yasuke did not understand the significance of the conflict that he was involved in, and also he wasn't Japanese. So that kind of saved his life. Now, what about his latter life? So after this Honnoji incident, records of Yasuke's life kind of becomes obscure. There are no concrete records detailing his activities or fate following his return to the Jesuits. So it's kind of possible he continued to serve the Jesuit community in Japan. But yeah, this is kind of speculative, but likely. Yeah. Back to the old grind. Anyways, I would say that Yasuke's legacy has definitely endured because it's a fascinating story. I mean, you have this cultural exchange between Africa and Japan, and as you might guess, or actually you might not know, Yasuke has been celebrated in a lot of various media, more than you might think, in literature and TV and film, and kind of romanticized, as why I put part of the title as African Samurai. Oh, but some of the misunderstandings and clarifications. And this is where some of the debate is going. Samurai versus retainer versus servant versus slave. So I think, again, Yasuke's role as a samurai needs to be understood within the context of the period. So he was indeed considered a samurai. His path to this status was atypical. He wasn't hereditary samurai. He wasn't a lifelong warrior trained from childhood. So that totally differentiates him from the traditional samurai class. He wasn't a mere servant or slave. By the symbolic trappings, his service under Nobunaga gave him a kind of a respected status. But it wasn't entirely equivalent to that of native-born samurai. Another thing, samurai and ninja. I mean, no, they're different. It's crucial to distinguish between samurai and ninja. Ninja is the N-word. Samurai were members of this warrior class with a code of honor and duty to their lords. Ninjas, or shinobi, they were covert agents, and they specialized in espionage, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare, and cocaine. Well, maybe not cocaine, but Yasuke was definitely a samurai, and he wasn't a ninja. Okay? So, but absolutely, he lived, at least for those 15 months, a really, really unique position, unique life and position. I mean, Oda Nobunaga was probably one of the most powerful historical figures in Japanese history. So earlier I talked about the whole legend of Yasuke in popular culture. I'm looking at a list of at least 5 novels by Japanese. We have Kurosuke by Yoshio Kurusu. We have Kurumbo by Shusaku Endo. Kurumbo is the N-word in Japanese. Yuki Hideyasu by Masahiro Oshima. And Momoyama Beat Tribe, like that one, by Junki Amano. And then, I don't know how this translated, but The Man Who Wanted to Be King by Ito Jun. I'm also looking at, like, bloody 7 comics. The one you probably heard about is Afro Samurai. That's by Takashi Okazaki. They have Hyoge Mono by Yoshihiro Yamada. You have Nobunaga Concerto by Ayumi Ishii. You have Cyborg 009, The End Nobunaga by Junya Arai. You have Sengoku Yatagarasu by Hirokazu Kobayashi. Nobunaga's Chef by Mitsuru Nishimura and Takuro Kajikawa. And finally, in all caps, we have Yasuke by Satoshi Okunishi. In anime, I didn't even know this. There's Yasuke, which is on Netflix. As far as drama, we have a whole bunch of NHK stuff, and I still won't pay. Nobunaga, the King of Jipangu, 1992 NHK. Hideyoshi, 1996 NHK. Gunshi Kanbei, 2014 NHK. And finally, NHK, for its broadcast satellite programming in 2021, they created Black Samurai Yasuke, the African samurai who served Nobunaga. Okay, and movies, I don't know these ones, but The Emperor's Sword by Toei, 2007, Yasuke, Lionsgate Films, 2016, and The Neck by Kadokawa. And while you may have heard recently about Ubisoft's issue with Assassin's Creed in the Shadows, there are at least 4 other games that include some Yasuke-type character. Basara 2 is one. Nobunaga's Ambition Creation. Another one is Neo. And finally, Samurai Warriors 5. Woo! That sounds exciting. And finally, there's a number of stage plays, adaptations and portrayals. So, I don't know. Maybe this didn't help a single bit, but maybe it did. I'm just trying to give you a little bit more of a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of Yasuke's life, and really try to get rid of all these misconceptions, that are going around. That's all. And if you actually have more questions, just put them down in the comments below, and I'm just going to type up what most of what I put out here. And of course, if you please like and subscribe. And you can always put more requests. And that's it. Oh, yes, and the background music, I hope I don't get in trouble. It's one of my favorite dead regimes. It is the national anthem of the Soviet Union, but it's mixed with Pachelbel's canon in D minor, because they are very, very similar. No, I'm not a communist, and I'm not a big fan of all that stuff. I'm just effing with you. Have a good day.